Great. So my name is Nai Kalima, and on behalf of Data for Policy, I'm really excited to welcome you all to the Data for Policy Zoom talk. Tonight's talk, titled Digital Colonialism, will feature Dr. Michael Kwet, a visiting fellow at Yale Law School and host of the Tech Empire podcast. Tonight's event um, is also co-sponsored by the IAS Critical Digital Studies Reading Group at UCL, and we're really honored to have Dr. Kwet speak with us tonight. Dr. Michael Kwet will discuss digital colonialism, exploring moral and geopolitical dilemmas relating to digital infrastructures and the global digital economy. Following his lecture, there will be an audience Q&A. Kwet received his Ph.D. in Sociology from Rhodes University and is a visiting fellow of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. He is also the author of Digital Colonialism, U.S. Empire, and the New Imperialism in the Global South, and host of the Tech Empire podcasts, and editor of the forthcoming volume of the Cambridge Handbook of Race and Surveillance, due out later in 2021 from the Cambridge University Press. Dr. Kwet has been published at numerous outlets, including the New York Times, Al Jazeera, The Intercept, Vice News, Wired, Counterpunch, and Roar magazine, and he works as an activist on campaigns to resist digital colonialism. We are really excited to hear Dr. Kwet's talk and look forward to learning more about digital colonialism. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Kwet. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me on, Nai. Okay, so so today I'll spend about 30 minutes chatting about this, and then we'll open up for Q&A. And I'm gonna share some slides, but they're entertaining slides. And I promise that the speech will be entertaining. So here we go. And informative, etc. Okay, so digital colonialism is something that I basically kind of didn't set out to study, but when I went to South Africa, I had to pick a topic, and I picked education technology and for sociology. And it became apparent to me very quickly that big tech dominates the space. It was especially Microsoft in South Africa in the education space. They have a small army of teacher trainers and so on, but the more you looked around, the more you saw that the tech giants were everywhere, and they were colonizing the space. So I wound up doing my PhD dissertation on digital colonialism in the education system in South Africa, and then I just kept expanding out on the topic from there. So the question, what is digital colonialism? We can go through it rather quickly and just say that it's, I see it as an evolution of the colonial order that started hundreds of years ago and has evolved throughout the years. So obviously it's not a process of violent conquest of the land and population transfer and settlements, but it's an evolution of a global inequality that was opened up during the last several hundred years. And principally, it's about political, economic, and social control of another group of people or territory, which is achieved principally through the ownership and control of digital technology. And so if you look out at the digital landscape, the big tech corporations own the means of computation, they own the intellectual property, and they design the tech systems and infrastructure for extraction and profit and control. And so they're able to do things like suck up all the data, make decisions that are political decisions for other, extrajudicially for other territories. For example, they can decide to ban legally permissible speech on a platform, or they can shape what people see and things like that. So there's a political dimension of it, and from that perspective, it's really just about the kind of global context of what big tech is, and we'll get back to the question of um, who owns the digital economy from a national base. But just to compare to classic colonialism, real quick, you had during the era of classic colonialism things like railroads that were built. Here, this is in Kenya. The colonizers come in and they build railroads, and they're not built to connect local villages and benefit the lives of indigenous persons, but rather they're built and designed to connect up military outposts, the seaports, and places where they're putting people to work for the extraction of raw materials. And then they're bringing those raw materials out, shipping them back to the mother country, and using them to mass manufacture goods for the Industrial Revolution. So in a similar sense today, we have a structure, we have these almost an invisible structure, right? There are physical things like cloud server farms and transoceanic cables and things like that. But we have systems that are basically designed for extraction of things like data and rent extraction for things like cloud computing and so on. And so it's a form of infrastructural domination. If you play video games, you might look at it like Age of Empires, where as time goes on, you want certain things, gunboats and different kinds of mining architecture, or mining gear and so on and so forth, factories to produce steel and things like that. Well, today you want cloud server farms, you want operating systems and these kinds of things. So, all right, there was another feature in the colonial era is panoptic structures, and obviously a panopticon is a structure in which there's a watcher in the middle of a physical space, and the people being watched don't know if they're being watched or not at any given point in time. And the idea was that workers and prisoners could self-discipline themselves because they think they might be watched by an authority figure, and so they'll conform to the expectations of that authority figure. And there is a panoptic structure to a lot of what these tech platforms or how they're organized, so that the quote unquote person in the middle is able to see what's going on. And obviously we have that both in the commercial sector and in the government sector. So you have Facebook that sits in between users and the company. I think people are less worried about Facebook watching them, at an individual level, but we learned through the Snowden leaks that they partnered with the National Security Agency, and that these kind of panoptic structures, platforms, subject people to government surveillance. I will say that on that topic, it's kind of interesting that people in the United States don't seem as concerned with that anymore. But when I've done things like travel to the Middle East and train people in cybersecurity or talk to them about these issues, they still do worry about government surveillance. So it depends on where you are in the world as to how much at a personal level people really think that this matters to them and their communities. So I'm just going to speed through this here and just say that big tech also obviously, from a political standpoint, technology is being used for policing. It's used by militaries, law enforcement agencies. It polices immigration, the streets, for surveillance cameras, and has obviously concerned communities of color and the poor. That it's a tool that winds up being used for social control. And here we have Microsoft. This is something I want to return to later, but they have a wide range of policing solutions, prison software, all sorts of things like that. So I want to turn to the question of political economy. So there's this big question here. We hear a lot about China. And if you look at the mainstream conversations about the global digital economy, it's generally juxtaposing the United States and China. And one might get the impression that there's some sort of parity between the two. There's a lot of talk about China, the rise of China, and its GDP is very large, and they're going to eventually eclipse the United States and take over the world in some accounts. So one of the scholars that I've tuned into, Sean Stars, has done a lot of research on the US versus China question. And his postdoc was overseen by Noam Chomsky. His doctoral dissertation was overseen by Leo Panitch, who is a great Marxist scholar that unfortunately, tragically died of COVID recently, but well respected. So his work has been groomed over by experts, and what part of how he's evaluated this question of who's dominant in the global economy, because we're in a globalized context. So if you read his dissertation, he talks about how when we looked at something like GDP post World War II, where the United States had, by many accounts, about 40% of the world's GDP, that there was more domestic production. And we now live in a situation where we have kind of globalized production along commodity chains. And so a better way of looking at who dominates is to look at transnational corporations. So if you look here, this is data on the screen is from Forbes 2000. So top 2,000 corporations that Stars tabulated here. And the data here is from 2020. He sent me his updated data in a personal email. And so here you can see he's talking about profit share here. IT and software, US is 76% to China's 10%. Tech, hardware, and equipment, US is 63% to China's 6%. Electronics, US is 43% to China's 10%. And the image on the screen of the world's top 100 biggest companies, if you look at the US there, it's overwhelmingly giant, right? And the top right is European countries. Way in the bottom, India is down there, has almost nothing, even though they have over 1 billion people. And China has over 1.5 billion people. And so the United States has 4% of the world's population. So we can see visually there that the United States is a minority of the world's people. And it's not just in tech, it's in wealth in general, that they dominate the global economy. And it's their rich, of course. It's not the common, person walking around the street, even though there are issues of how much resources people in the developed world are entitled to and consuming, something we'll return to. But if you look and you start, so that was aggregate data. And if you look at the big ticket items, the things that people are using all of the time, your search engines, web browsers, smartphone and tablet operating systems, desktop and laptop operating systems, cloud computing. If you keep going down the line, you'll see that the United States dominates in most countries most of the big tech and or big the core tech services. And so because people are using these things all the time, all day long, that's why they get so big, because they're essentially essential infrastructure. I threw an image in there of US military bases that's around China, just as also another image, a symbol of US dominance, right? There's no reciprocal Chinese military bases at the Mexican border or Canadian border or anything like that. And I want to note that in speaking about US and China in this way, I'm not denying China's human rights violations or even some of the stuff they do outside their borders, like they're putting high-tech surveillance, selling high-tech surveillance, safe, what they call safe cities systems to a lot of governments in the global south, especially in Africa. And those things are used to or intended at least to repress people, and often by authoritarian governments. But it still doesn't mean that there's parity between the US and China at all. And so if we look at the global political economy here, it's one in which colonialism, the colonization of markets, is the central model of big tech, and it's predominantly an American empire project. So if we're to further contextualize this, there is an issue that we all are aware of right now, which is an environmental crisis. And the environmental crisis is not just of overheating the earth, but biodiversity collapse, ecosystem collapse, and an issue of ecological sustainability that goes beyond just overheating the planet. So a great body of scholarship is showing that growth itself, aggregate economic growth for all humans on Earth and all societies together is not sustainable. I included here the UN Sustainable Development Goal 12 from 2019, and they essentially endorse the perspective of what's called degrowth, the notion that there are limits to economic growth, which of course everybody acknowledges because there can't be infinite, unlimited growth on a finite planet. But the premise is that we've already reached this, that we're already overshooting. And so there is a great deal of science that is estimating about 50 billion tons of aggregate extraction is sustainable per year, and that we're currently at a level of about 100 billion tons. And if you look at the data there, the high income countries are per capita, per person, consuming about, it's now about 28 tons per person per year. The low income persons are about 2 tons per person per year. And the sustainable limit is probably somewhere about 6 to 8. And that's based on evaluations by environmentalists. And a good place to get some of the best references on that is Jason Hickel. And so there are physical limits. And if we're going to think about technology, in addition to that, so the idea is that we have to cap aggregate material resource use. And if we're going to cap that, then we have a maldistribution problem. We have an inequality problem where you can't just quote unquote grow all economies, and if everybody gets a little more at the end of the day, then it's all good. In other words, we need to redistribute wealth, and we have to reorient the economy to be sustainable. so that we can't have an economy that's based on accumulation and growth, which is what a capitalist economy is based on. So there's an unequal exchange and division of labor here. And so there are certain, reasons that people in the global north are able to get more material resources for the work that they do. There isn't equal pay for equal work, but above and beyond that, there is an inequality of things that people do in economies. The rich countries, for the rich countries, tech is very lucrative, and it gets you a lot of, you know, stuff in exchange for other things in the global economy. So if you're making computer processors or a search engine, you're able to accumulate a lot more than if you're digging in the dirt for metal in the Congo, for example, right? So that unequal exchange and division of labor is very prevalent, and it's a part of the global tech economy in digital colonialism, because primarily led by the United States, the means of computation, the intellectual property, and those kinds of things, well, those are owned and dominated by their corporations, and so they're keeping a status quo intact that benefits them. And there's another part of this where there's a little study there. Shifting economic activity to services has limited potential to reduce global environmental impacts due to the household consumption of labor. And basically what it's saying is even if you're in the service sector, you're basically trading with the material goods sector, and then you're accumulating wealth, and you're not necessarily environmentally sustainable. So if you think about a Google or Microsoft employee that's making $250,000 a year, well, they may be sitting around on a computer all day long, but they get a huge paycheck, and then they go out and they buy and consume lots of stuff. So that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable unless you have inequality and you peg poor people into their position of doing menial labor in exchange for that. So we don't talk about that in our conversations about tech. And so here I want to go into this issue of tech hegemony, and what is the dominant narrative in the conversations that we have about tech. So the premise here is that American intellectuals dominate. Europeans, of course, are a big part of the conversation, but to a much lesser extent. So you have your Zuboffs and your Tim Woos and really most of the big names in the conversation about tech ethics are U.S. based. There are some Europeans, but they're usually not quite as popular, and their institutions tend to dominate. And we'll get to that in a second. But there's basically two branches of narrative. So I'm looking at the leftmost end of the spectrum in the mainstream, and that's your law and policy and your human rights. And if you're looking at American law and policy, you can look at antitrust. Well, what does antitrust say? Antitrust says that the ideal state of the economy is competitive capitalism. And if you trace the history of antitrust, even going back to Brandeis, where the leftmost end of the spectrum goes, really the tradition in the history is basically saying that monopolies and large companies distort the market, and that they basically bully employees and workers and consumers, and they're unhealthy for the economy. So that basically what we need to do when we have these big companies is change the rules and take legal action against them, maybe break them up or whatever, to shrink them or stop the bullying behavior. But the fundamental premise behind it is that competitive capitalism is the ideal state of the economy. That's what it aims for. Now, my criticisms here are, one, that the antitrust is both nationalist and imperialist. It's nationalist because it aims itself towards um, harms to their own citizen base. So if you look at the reports put out by the US, the UK, the EU, Australia, take your pick, everything is concerned with the harms to their own citizens. Yet the issue with these transnational corporations, especially in America, is that these companies have global reach. And um, and we'll get to Europe in a second, but there's no consideration for harms to other people who are subjected to these systems. And that's a real problem. Um, Structural inequality. So going back to competitive capitalism, if we really believe that there are things like structural racism that follow from the capitalist system, it doesn't matter if it's more competitive at the end of the day. I mean, it does insofar as I would agree that antitrust is better than nothing, but it doesn't change the structural inequality of capitalism, and so that's embedded in it. And there's no way out of that if you're organizing your economy around profit and accumulation and growth. The literature that I'm sampling here, Lena Kahn, Matt Stoller, Barry Lynn, Zephyr Teachout, Tim Wu is another one. There's no such thing as an American empire. So all the things that we were talking about earlier, big tech, it has no, there's no such, they don't even bring up the issue of American dominance in the situation. And that's even though that's the dominant issue, that is the most important issue, is not even brought up by antitrust people, and they don't talk about the environment. As far as Europe goes, there's a real interesting thing here. In Europe, the rich European countries are calling for their own unicorns and tech giants. The UK wants to produce $1 trillion behemoth. Macron in France wants to pump billions into startups so that they have 25 unicorns by 2025. Germany and the Netherlands are doing similar things. The EU's competition commissioner, Margaret Vestager, told the press that Europe needs to build its own tech giants. So when we're actually looking at the question of what's going on with antitrust, this is opportunism. Nobody sits there and says, well, what about a place like Namibia or Zimbabwe or the Congo or even South Africa, right? How can they compete? Who's going to be able to compete in the digital economy once the antitrust litigation goes through, right? Who's lined up to be the next winners in the game of global capitalism? Well, this is about them positioning themselves. There's no reparations. There's no consideration for people. In South Africa, up to as many as 80% of grade 4 learners can't read for meaning in any language. So how are they going to compete, right? So there's nobody even brings these issues up, and so that's your antitrust. Your human rights sector is very familiar to, I'm sure, everybody who's listening. So disparate impact, algorithmic bias, and facial recognition, predictive policing, digital redlining and housing, things like that. There's a call for unionization of all tech workers. Tech workers are all lumped together. I think that's an issue because while unionizing may be good for people who work at Google and Microsoft and so on, and I don't have in mind here, call center workers and people who really need immediate help in their situation. But I have in mind the white collars who are getting $250,000 a year, and I'm not unsympathetic to, I want to be clear, things like discrimination and rights there. But at the end of the day, we don't call for unionization of Raytheon or Pfizer or Shell Oil, et cetera, East India Company. So we don't have a conversation about that. I think that's an issue. And then the human rights calls for limited bans. So that would be tech to do with violence. Don't sell your technology to the military, or ban facial recognition, that kind of stuff. So I want to have two more little sections here. So why is there no discussion to speak of? It's very extreme margins to talk about colonialism. And my argument here is that digital colonialism, especially American empire, should be the center piece of the conversation. That if you really believe that the people who are harmed most by the tech are the ones who should be centered in our considerations, then why is it that this isn't discussed? And the best I can come up with over the years of looking at this issue is that the conversation is dominated by elite academia, corporate media, think tanks, and NGOs. There's big tech, there's big foundation money and money from big tech, and they basically set the agenda. And it doesn't seem like it's in their own self-interest to bring these issues up as individuals, but I think these are institutional problems. So to just give us a simple example here, I ran a piece on the metaverse. I could only get it in the South African press. I tried a few US outlets. And when we saw people talking about all these articles that were coming out about it, nobody ever pointed out that it's all American corporations who are set to build this supposed new VR AR oriented future internet. Whether or not it ever comes to fruition, it's all American corporations that are set to build it. And then there's some mention of Tencent trying to do their own version for China, right? Which is supposed to be for China. Whereas the rest, Americans, are supposed to be for the world. There's also a digital divide issue. Putting these expensive goggles on your face, or buying these things and the setup you need, having AR goggles or glasses, these are expensive things. So who are going to be the ones who are really participating in this? Again, no comment at all in any of the press articles anywhere, zero. And then, of course, this is a monumental waste of money. I mean, people don't have health care. They don't have, medicine and housing. And there's a lot of money being spent on this. And who knows if it'll ever even turn out. It's a gamble. So there's a quote here from a book by Yard and Katz. And he basically says, if you look at the left end of the spectrum, there's a huge difference, he says, between activists who are fighting the oppression of their own communities and academics at prestigious universities who bankrolled by the likes of Google or Microsoft. And here he had in mind AI now and data and society. But it's not just them. Speak of social justice activism, they have the latter have the largest megaphone, and they pen pieces for the largest media outlets, and venues like Wall Street Journal, etc. And yet the activist communities do not. And as he put it, the community organizers considered in the chapter that he's writing there, by contrast, do not swim in these circles. They are oppressed by them. And so access to media, all this kind of stuff, I think is a big issue. Now, if you look in the slide here, these are a collection of some of the institutions that are dominant in producing the narrative. And if you look on the right, you have money coming in, not only from the big tech companies on the top there, but the foundation money. And those foundations are not, as far as I'm concerned, interested in talking about American imperialism and giving a serious opposition to it, like a sustained, pervasive, constantly bringing it up conversation. American imperialism is a real problem in the tech thing. It is central to it. It's not something we just bring up in passing on occasion or nod our head in agreement because we want to feel like we're leftists. It's something that we should be centering our conversation on. Well, nobody on the left-hand side is doing that. And that's not arbitrary. It's just not arbitrary. So, here's a good case example. I have these slides titled "How to Hide an Empire." That's a book about American expansionism, but it's also being done here with tech. So here, Microsoft has its hands all over the policing space, and there's little discussion about it. Now, if we're looking, there's an article there, "The Invention of Ethical AI," which was run at the Intercept in, I think it was December 2019. Some people didn't like it. It named AI Now and it named Data in Society. They're in the process of basically, especially AI Now, of trying to pivot their public image. But they're, they were co-headed by Kate Crawford until she was basically forced out. They're taking money right now from Pivotal Ventures, which is Melinda Gates. There's a lot more stuff we can go into, but this conversation is not one that's being handled well. So this is NYU is working with Microsoft, and they just created a lecture series on race and technology. Microsoft's giving money to Black Lives Matter, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody says anything about this. It's ultra hard to find anybody say anything. And some of the speakers they have in that race and tech series are prominent people in the field. They're getting paid. I contacted Charlton McIlwain, who is one of the co-organizers and a professor at NYU, and asked, how much are y'all getting paid? And he wouldn't give an answer. So, and if you look at the series so far, it's completely and utterly whitewashed Microsoft's role in the world. Now, I want to go back to real quick the issue of the economy, because it's not just about Microsoft and policing. For example, if we want to look at a case example, here, city of Joburg, Microsoft planned to train 1 million people. Google, there's a little quote down there where Google said about training people on software, Google software in Africa. He said, we're not going to just knock at the door anymore. We're going to bang. So why should Google be banging on the door in Africa to get their software in there? The notion of these tech corporations dominating the digital economy it's just taken for granted. America owns the world. It's naturalized. It's normalized, and there's tons and tons of stuff like this going on all over the place, and there's almost no conversation about it. I just want to mention real quick, don't have time to really go into it, but a lot of the narratives that are generated around things like, responsible AI, ethical AI, and stuff like that, that places like Data in Society and AI Now, championed over the years, they are replicated oftentimes in the global South. And I think in part that's because people look out for the criticism, and this is what they find because it's what's most visible. So I just want to close out very briefly and say that alternatives to the status quo require striking at the roots of the problem. And so I have an article coming out called The Digital Tech Deal. It's a socialist framework, and basically it calls for socializing the means of computation, intellectual property, phasing things out, and shifting these things over to the public sector. When we look at stuff like, for example, the people's vaccine to deal with COVID, one of the things that's often brought up is, why do we have medical patents at all whatsoever? Why not just publicly fund the research for vaccines and medication and just make it all publicly available? And there's no profiteering off of it. Doctors across the world make their research public, and then people can produce it at cost. They can make generics across the world. That's a huge threat to the drug industry. The tech industry might be a little bit more complex, sure, but we should be talking about doing the same thing. Going back to the environment, it's not inequality is not sustainable, and big tech will always create inequality. Digital capitalism, even a more competitive, antitrust regulated digital capitalism, will always produce inequality. And we need to really create harmony on planet Earth between people, and we can't do that within this capitalist framework. So obviously, we can't dismantle things overnight, but we should be constantly talking about, and not just talking, but driving our activism and our efforts towards getting rid of a capitalist digital economy and making it a global public interest one. And that has to be done. So some strategies for that: education, worker organizing, bottom-up grassroots movements, that I think, for academics, trying to make stuff that can be consumed by, and like, in addition to working with the grassroots directly, integration with eco-socialism and other movements. So I think if we're looking at things like a Green New Deal or a Red Deal, that tech goes hand in hand with the environment. So I think bringing that out, direct action, global solidarity, reparations, things like that. And I just want to say real quick, wrapping up. So these are some resources on this. I published a guide called People's Tech for People's Power out of a kind of electronic civil rights and liberties group in South Africa, Right to Know. And it has a lot of stuff that people can use themselves, and a little talk about policy, but there's also some good stuff here. The British Digital Cooperative, a new model public sector institution by Dan Hind, is the most detailed thing I've ever seen for how we can basically socialize the tech economy. He argues for it as a public option, but I think that going in a direction like that, like how do we get the R&D done and all that stuff, right? I really recommend checking that out. Platform Socialism will be coming out soon by James Muldoon. And Democratic Digital Infrastructure, that's I think it was Commonwealth UK put that out. So look, there's some ideas out there, but I think at the end of the day, what we need to do is we need to reconstruct our framework around anti-imperialism, having a really truly global lens, and looking at institutional problems more deeply and consistently, and to come up with alternatives that we push for, that go beyond things like competitive capitalism and regulating and getting the corporations to behave nicely, instead of just trying to break them down and get rid of them as fast as possible. So yeah, that's it.
Dr. Kwet, thank you for your fantastic presentation. We're going to switch over to a Q&A portion. And so if people would like to raise their hand to ask their question, or if they would like me to ask their question, you can drop it into the chat, or you can please raise your hand. But maybe to get us started, to kick us off, I really appreciate your talk and thoughtful remarks on digital colonialism, and also thinking about it in a more planetary manner. And so one of the things that I was curious about is, in terms of thinking about things like the digital economy and digital trade, and not only, some of the possible harms, but maybe some of the opportunities for countries in the global South. When you look at things like I think there are negotiations that are ongoing with regard to things like the e-commerce, how e-commerce will be treated, whether it will be taxed or not taxed at the level of the WTO. And I'm really interested in how does global governance around the digital economy facilitate digital colonialism, or can be used to inhibit it. And so I wanted to see what your thoughts may be about that to get us started, but hopefully more questions will pour in.
Sure. E-commerce negotiations at the WTO have been scrutinized pretty well by Renata Vila has been one. Somebody at the CEPR, whose name escapes me for the moment, but that's with Dean Baker. She did a nice job. And there was recently a publication out on digital colonialism and trade negotiations in Europe that was put out by the Transnational Institute. But I think, from my standpoint, one of the things the WTO does is protect intellectual property. So if we're going to look at the, root issue, I think that intellectual property is a big one. There are interesting issues on that I'm not. I mean, they really have to have nuance. So it's something like, say, data localism, right? Like, all right, if you're hosting your data locally in a cloud, let's say you have a cloud center, inside the country, and that data doesn't leave the country. So it can't, for example, be intercepted by the NSA. It's usually a national security thing. That won't necessarily stop, say, a Facebook from operating in your country. As far as global governance goes, in terms of things like taxation and even antitrust, the United States will retaliate against you if they perceive that you're trying to push things too far. So if you remember when France was talking about a digital attacks on the social media companies to support their media, just as Australia is doing, the United States initially threatened tariffs, right? And if they push it too far, that's what they'll do. They have power. And if you're a smaller country like South Africa or even smaller, you can't, there's going to be limitations on the basis of what kind of things that you can demand. Actually, in antitrust, you can demand a structural breakup of these, of like Facebook, for example. But can you imagine, for example, Namibia's courts saying we're gonna break up Facebook, and our courts say, like US will say get lost. So I mean, there's a real power element in this. I think that's why even though I'm like, in saying everything I said, I'm not against reforms in general, because you can't go from A to Z, but we can't go too slowly from A to B to C, and I think there's a need for global solidarity and real grassroots movement around the issue in order to be able to push for more stronger solutions than give us some of your giant pot of money as a tax, and you get to keep dominating the platforms in the show, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have some really thoughtful comments in the chat, and some really great questions have come in from Dr. Mustafa Saeed Ali. And maybe the first one is, insofar as American imperialism is entangled with white supremacy and the colonial project was always racially inflected, to what extent should the analytical frame be nuanced to racialize political economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer to that question, but obviously it should, that race and racism is a huge issue in this. It's no mistake that the global South is primarily non-white, right? And the dominance of American empire and American imperialism is a racialized thing. It's not an arbitrary thing. So I do think that racism is a huge thing in this. And, there has been very recently renewed kind of emphasis on race in general societal discourse that I think is really important. At the same time, it could be something like, I would say, honest, I'm going to be honest, I would say that it's racist to be ignoring American imperialism in this scholarship, right? So, I mean, are you going to call all the leading scholars in the field racist? I mean, we could. I mean, so like, I mean, the people are throwing the racism word at people a lot, and I fear sometimes that either if you do it yourself and they're deserving of it, you might get some backlash for it, or alternatively, that people will turn you off. But the point is taken. It is true. American imperialism is a racist thing, and there's no way around it. And if we're going to pretend that it doesn't exist, it's racist. So I appreciate the point that you're making, and I do agree with you that this is structural racism, and it's something that is a huge part of the conversation for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. I think there was another question from Mustafa, and this question was, what if the problem is not solely about transforming the political economy of tech to one that is socialist or anarchist, but questioning whether certain kinds of tech should be developed, period? Hashtag elitism, hashtag abolitionism.
Sure. No, I agree with that. And it's I mean, I think that's part of the issue of socialism. To me, is about values and equality, right? So you have a political economy version of trying to make those values come to life, right? So obviously a fundamental thing about socialism is class abolition, right? Everybody should have a decent standard of living, and there shouldn't be inequality to speak of. That doesn't mean that everybody necessarily has exactly the same access to resources. You could have a situation in which some people who do more risky and onerous things get a little bit of extra reward for it. There are proposals um, in the socialist literature along those lines, but ultimately it's about equality. And capitalism is openly. We don't believe that equality is necessary or just for society. And so, if you want to look at something like, and I agree, it's not just all political economy, but I think those values. So, if you do want to look at something like facial recognition or all sorts of military applications and technologies, I think that there are questions about. I think some of this stuff shouldn't be developed. Um, I think the question gets more interesting, Mustafa. I know that you're big on the decolonize AI and asking the question about the development of these things. And at a basic level, I think conversations about what should be developed and not, like if something is fundamental like blockchain or NFTs. We see a lot of controversy behind these things, cryptocurrencies. Um, are those or should those things not be developed at all? Um, or are they so basic that maybe certain manifestations of them shouldn't be developed? These are interesting questions. I mean, we can be basic about like something like computer vision, right? Like, is computer vision going to be used in ways that we just can't stop, that are negative, right? So, I mean, I think the point's taken, and I do agree that certain things, maybe you or somebody else can come up with a list of ones that are maybe we should be debating about whether or not we develop them at all.
Thank you, Michael. Um, I don't know. Let's see if we have any more questions. Yeah. Okay, I think we have a question from my colleague Josh. So I'll turn it over to him.
Okay, no, I was just going to talk to her. Okay.
Okay.
Is it good?
Okay. I think we're good now.
Check that. So, yeah. Okay. There we go. We got it. So in the context of global conversation, assuming that the U.S. isn't going to transfer into like a paradigm of socializing platforms, even in the context of Elizabeth Warren's kind of pursuits from the left, pushing that angle. And there's still a lot of concern in the context of U.S. policy around if we regulate, for instance, our domestic platforms, we're reducing our ability to have a competitive stance against, the potential for rising influence from China, assuming that they actually do regulate domestically, and that does kind of reduce power. What do you see as the strategies that you like to see emerge in the context of the global South in order to, for instance, either build out domestic public sector industry or build out domestic private sector industry that works, depending on the context? What are the strategies that you see kind of emerging, or that you would like to see emerge? And also, are there any unintended consequences of a mass retreat of U.S. existing dominance?
Well, it's a big question. So I think first and foremost, having an accurate or a better recognition and understanding of the imperialist nature of the global tech economy is a starting point. So if in my travels and people I've talked to in the global South and I work with are in agreement that attention to things like the imperialism of opening up a cloud server farm in your city doesn't take precedent, over getting employment or making sure you have food or electricity, right? So it's hard to sometimes engage in what seems like esoteric issues. And I think that nevertheless, it needs to be done. And that means there needs to be some more attention and, troops, so to speak, in the global South. I'm not saying there's not any. I'm just saying percentage wise, there still needs to be probably some more brain space devoted to it. Because it's just such a big part of the global economy. And I think it's getting there, but it's taken some time. As far as like, would there be a power vacuum if there was a withdrawal? I mean, I don't see there being a withdrawal in a sense that if you're socializing the digital economy, in the sense that if you were doing something like phasing out intellectual property and patents, and you were producing your research and development, and just disclosing your research openly, I don't see why there would all of a sudden be a vulnerability, say, to the invasion of Chinese technology, right? So, I mean, and I think reparations is a big part of this. So, intellectual property, I've seen others recommend that if you're doing technology and knowledge transfer, scientific knowledge transfer, things like that, you're basically, that could be seen as a form of reparations. And obviously we need to simultaneously build the capacity for knowledge production in the global South, so it's not just passive receiving of knowledge, so to speak. But the idea would be that you're trying to work on all those things at once. And then there is physical infrastructure. So these cloud server farms that are being built, assuming we want to make use of them, they could be donated instead of Microsoft or Amazon cloud centers. So I think that In terms of a model for development, this is where things, I think, there needs to be a lot of engagement and dialogue and brainstorming. I mean, I talked to Nye, for example, in a different conversation, and I've talked to others. Well, sometimes the state is not a good state, right? Obviously, in the global south. So if you're relying on your public sector, it's hard to be constructive for human rights and well-being in that sense, right? But I do think that the kind of proposal that Dan Hind made with a digital cooperative corporation, or however he put it, I do think that those things could serve as models for things to aspire to, as a pragmatic way of changing the production of new knowledge in research and development. So I think that there are options there, but I think what we need to do is challenge the privatization of technology and its imperialist manifestation, and we need to put it in that framework. And I also think that we need to link these things up with other struggles, and that's why I said, in the digital tech deal, the article I have come out in January, that if you look at these People's Green New Deal or the Red Deal by the Red Nation, they're talking about really left-oriented, egalitarian alternatives for reorienting the economy for, so it doesn't get destroyed. And they don't talk about tech. So that's an opportunity to bring in the tech issue there, and also simultaneously for those who are with tech to bring in their issues into your thing. So I think building synergies across movements is really important too.
Michael, we're a bit over time, but this has been a fantastic talk and initial dialogue, and I'm so thankful that you were able to join us tonight. I'd like to thank everyone for attending Data for Policy's first Zoom talk. And as we close, I want to send a very special thank you to Emily, Zeynep, Andrew, and Itzel at Data for Policy for tonight's event, and to my colleague Josh Etzminger from the Critical Digital Studies Reading Group, which will be happening right after tonight's discussion. And finally, a huge thanks to Dr. Kwet. Some of us will have the opportunity to meet again for tonight's Critical Digital Studies Reading Group that's happening next. But we hope that there will be other opportunities for us all to continue these types of conversations and the actions that must accompany them. And so thank you all for tonight's talk and session, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.